Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the Complex Trauma Training Center. I'm your host, Emily Ruth, and I'm so glad you've joined us today. Are you a mental health professional looking to deepen your clinical expertise in healing complex trauma? We're thrilled to announce our 2025 NARM Therapist trainings designed to provide you with transformative training in the NeuroAffective relational model. In 2025, we're offering 3 Level 2 NARM Therapist trainings, 2 live online cohorts, and 1 in-person training in Scottsdale, Arizona. Both the in-person Scottsdale training and the spring online cohort begin in January of 2025, and the summer online cohort begins in May of 2025. These NARM Therapist trainings consist of 4 weekend modules spread out over the year. Through this advanced clinical training, you'll learn how to confidently and compassionately heal the impact of adverse childhood experiences and C-PTSD. You'll gain specialized training in a relationally focused, neurobiologically informed clinical approach that supports the resolution of attachment, developmental, relational, cultural, and intergenerational trauma. And you'll be joining a dynamic community that offers multiple learning opportunities to deepen your professional and personal growth. Enrollment is open to licensed psychotherapists, counselors, social workers, and other licensed mental health professionals, as well as graduate trainees and interns working toward licensure. Visit ComplexTraumaTrainingCenter.com to register for the 2025 NARM Therapist training that best fits your schedule. We hope you will join us to learn how NARM can transform your practice. And now for our interview. Tobias Konermann is a clinical psychologist and psychotherapist practicing in Berlin, Germany. For the last decade, he has dedicated his professional research and work on how developmental and collective trauma impact our ability to be fully connected to our sense of self. He trains psychotherapists and coaches in principles of process-oriented work. Tobias is a leading faculty member in the Academy of Inner Science of Thomas Hübl and a teaching assistant in NARM trainings in Europe. Please enjoy this conversation with Tobias Konermann and Brad Kammer.
Well, welcome, Tobias, to Transforming Trauma. So excited to have you on today.
Thank you, Brad. Thank you for having me. And it's a pleasure, yeah.
Yeah, I've been waiting for this conversation. You put out an article, I don't know how long ago, a few months ago in English, and we've just been eating it up over here in the United States. So I'm excited to dive into it with you. But first, I want to start just by asking you, what are you hoping listeners might get out of our time here together?
Well, hopefully fruitful dialogue between us and mainly getting a bit of a deeper insight in what the article is about. And for me, that's mainly kind of the inner architecture or deeper principles of at least what I consider most interesting, intriguing in the NARM model. Yeah.
Great. Maybe that's a good place to start. Just who are you? Where are you? And what's your relationship to NARM?
Yeah. So I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm a psychotherapist. I'm situated in Berlin, Germany. I have been involved a lot in the NARM trainings in Europe the last years. Been working as a TA with Larry's training, but also with other teachers in Europe. I offer trainings for psychotherapists and coaches in kind of principle-based, process-oriented approaches. And yeah, that's what I'm currently doing. And I think I got involved in NARM 8-10 years ago.
Do you remember what brought you into NARM?
Actually, a client. I had challenges working with her, and she one day brought a book to a session, said, "You should read this." And I did. And in retrospect, I'm not sure if I was able to help her at the time because it was challenging, but I'm grateful for her for introducing me to that kind of work. And I read the book. Back in the time, there was this one video of Larry on YouTube. That was in the very beginnings where the trainings were still very new in Europe. Mm-hmm. And then I found out pretty soon that that's for me. Yeah.
And it sounds like you've already been interested in more process-oriented therapy approaches. So maybe NARM fit well for you at the time?
Yeah, I was originally trained in CBT.
Oh.
And as you can imagine, that was also a hard time for me because I was very in the academic world, and CBT, I don't know how it is in the US, but in Germany, 95% of the universities, the faculties are in the hands of CBT-oriented therapy. And even during my basic training, I was already orienting towards humanistic approaches, Gestalt work, other process-oriented models, because I was very drawn to that, and psychodynamic schools. And then when I met the NARM model, things kind of, came together for me.
I'm so glad that happened and that your client gave you that gift.
Me too. Me too.
It's always funny when a client comes in and wants you to read something or watch something. And sometimes those can be really powerful.
Exactly.
It's interesting you brought up CBT, because one of the quotes that I pulled out from your article that I loved, it said, do treatments cure disorders or do relationships heal people?
Right.
And I love that, because there's like two different elements to that. One is about the treatment and one is about looking at our clients as people and not disorders.
Right.
So, but before we get into this, I probably should mention the article name. So it's How the NeuroAffective Relational Model Expands the Psychotherapeutic Landscape, about subjective depth and the effectiveness of process orientation. What was the impetus for writing this? Where did the inspiration come?
Actually, I just started writing it. I didn't have a specific goal in mind, or of course I had an idea it might be useful for the NARM audience or broader audience that's interested in the model, but I really just started writing it because I wanted to sort out some thoughts for myself. And I knew that there is this sort of intimate connection between why goal orientation can get so much in the way, why that's specifically the case when you understand the dynamics of developmental trauma, and then also how that all relates to this, what I call modes of processing in the article, and why the only entry gate is the here and now, like the phenomenological field. And I had actually kind of a need for myself to put these ideas together and make a kind of a coherent connection between them. And then I read it and I thought, that's useful. I showed it to Larry in Germany, and then things went on from there.
Can you share with us those two modes of processing?
Yeah. In the article, I base it on the left brain, right brain theories, in that case by Ian McGilchrist, but there are also other theories that address kind of basically two modes of how we process information, with the one being more analytical, kind of more, let's say, rational, and the other one being more gestalt-based, holistic, experiential. And that there's such a fundamental difference between them, how they let us orient towards the world, but also orient towards our own experience, and how they come into play when we do in NARM or in any therapeutic modality ask clients to inquire or to explore their own subjective world.
Is this what you were referring to as the analytic mode versus the experiential mode?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So the analytic mode is more, you were tying it a lot to like goal-oriented work and kind of more strategy-oriented therapy, whereas experiential mode, like you said, was more about kind of the relationship and intentionality.
Exactly. Yeah.
Can you share for folks, because this comes up a lot in trainings, as you know, the difference between goal orientation and intentional orientation?
Yeah. This comes. I know from the groups here that's coming up a lot, and then and then sometimes in some way halfway through the training, there's usually a voice from participants saying, "So actually, we do want something. It's not that we're just open for exploration. So what is this about goal orientation?" And I think how to solve, in a way, not to solve, but understand the paradox of we are not being goal-oriented, but of course we're going somewhere.
Yeah.
For me, that's through intentionality. Because intentionality being kind of to hold an orientation, but not to push for the direction. Larry sometimes says we want to hold the possibility for clients, but we don't want to make them go there.
Yeah.
And that simultaneous process, I think, is very key to the model and to understanding how the clinical application actually works, because we don't go with anything that comes up.
Yeah.
It's directed, but it's not pushing for change. In my words, I don't know how you would put it, but that's how I see it. Yeah.
Well, I want to actually use your words and to reflect back, because I thought you wrote this beautifully. You wrote, intentions connect us to the subjective depth of our wanting, while goals represent external and mostly behavioral fix points. Yeah. Yeah, I think of it exactly the same way. And I look to, spiritual and religious approaches because pretty much every spiritual and religious approach also talk about intentionality. Now, often it's in the language of prayer. That's often how they talk about it. But really, if you kind of deconstruct a lot of what prayer is about, it is about what we're yearning for and hoping for and how we
Right.
communicate that and relate to that.
Right. And it is very, very powerful to connect to a deep intention.
Yeah.
And only by doing that, so much that's naturally coming into our awareness that needs our attention. And that's exactly what we do in NARM also.
Yeah. Yeah, you said something in your article, I actually put it up on Facebook, that we talk about this a lot in our trainings, I'm sure you do too, that, when people are first being trained in NARM, they think often that the first pillar is just like setting up the therapy and the healing.
Mm-hmm. Right.
It's like, okay, you got to get this intention, this contract, and so you can start doing the real work. And we keep on saying to them, pillar one is healing in itself. And you say almost the exact same thing in your article, that the process of clarifying intentionality relationally is already part of the healing. Do you have any more to add to that?
No, I think that's exactly how you say it. It is maybe the most important undercurrent of every process. It actually organizes the process and the exploration. I imagine it like a stream, like an undercurrent in a river that, depending on where you are in the process, kind of comes to the surface and then, goes a bit more into underground. And of course, the whole, what we call core dilemma is directly, connected to that stream of a developmental impulse, actually. Yeah.
You want to say more about that? That's interesting, about the developmental impulse as part of the core dilemma.
Well, how I view it is that the intention we find is connected to a compromised developmental capacity that is then the center of the core dilemma, where these, shamed and rejected impulses are still in the grip of our shaming or self-rejection. And the fear that comes online when we start to untangle it or connect back to it. So I think it's just such a powerful principle to work with. And the other thing, what I find beautiful around the work of intentionality is that you cannot make an intention. It's a very receptive process, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Intention comes to you when you open yourself for finding one. It's not, you cannot generate it. You cannot, it is something that more opens up to you, actually, I would say. And then you take it from there.
Yeah. I feel like there's this really important thread that we're on right now, which is like this connection between intentionality, the core dilemma, and the process of subjectivity.
Right. Yeah.
And I know you talked a lot about that in your article too, but I just have another great quote from your article. You were talking about the core dilemma. You're writing about the core dilemma. And you said that this dynamic of the core dilemma serves the function of maintaining a degree of subjective control in the face of an uncontrollable situation. So getting kind of into this internal conflict keeps alive our subjectivity, our humanity, which then in the NARM approach, we invite from the very beginning through pillar one. Is that how you would kind of hold it as well?
Similarly, I would say that the attempt for the child to maintain a sense of control in an actually uncontrollable situation is more like sometimes I view it as postponing the hope for fulfilling the needs in the future, so that it's there, it exists, it's just not here now. Like it's there, it can be met, but it's just not now. So it's kind of a touching process, actually, that you preserve the existence of being met in your needs, but you just postpone it a bit into like, okay, when I'm like this or like that, then I will be loved, or then I can be seen, and of course that's then the birth of strategies and on the price that comes with it. But there's also something very touching in this attempt to maintain control by actually telling yourself, I can do it. I just have to be more like this or more that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense about the strategies developed to manage an uncontrollable situation. And then we end up relying on those strategies and enacting them. I mean, I want to talk a little bit later about the therapeutic enactments that happen in therapy. But the way I kind of often hold objectification is like, all these adaptive strategies, the adaptive survival styles create objectification for a child. So they start to relate to themselves. I call it like one-dimensional versus three-dimensional. It's like everything
Right.
gets collapsed and everything feels, splitting black and white, good and bad. Everything feels very clean in a certain way, even though it doesn't serve us and work for us. And this process of helping increase subjectivity, which starts from the very beginning of asking someone what it is that they desire or what they want for themselves is, and again, another quote from your article, I think you were quoting someone else, but you said that subjectivity is an experience of being pregnant with connection.
Right. Yeah.
Which I had never heard before. And I thought that was such a cool way of saying it.
Yeah. I think it's a quote from John Dewey. It's a philosopher. And I think that just in that fact also lies the power of, let's say, the reorganizing potential of inviting into subjective depth. Because when there's subjective depth or subjectivity versus objectification, then there's so much potency that can happen from there. And then we know that, like when we do process-oriented work, usually the very deep or transformative moments, they come quite surprising, or they probably have to. So you cannot just plan them or go for them, but just in this respectful or a deepening of subjectivity or subjective depth and creating more trust, then it can go into this pregnancy with connection. It can just bring up something that you would actually not expect, and then that turns out to be the most fundamental piece of the session.
Yeah, which then takes us into kind of the concept of agency, because as we're exploring this inner territory, the subjective depth, we learn more and get more connected to how we're relating to ourselves in ways that we haven't been aware of or felt kind of in an embodied way connected to. And I tell this story a lot in my teaching, that when Larry and I were working on the book that we released a couple of years ago, chapter 5, the chapter on agency, just was a blank screen on my computer. I could not figure out. And Larry and I would meet, and how do you put that into words?
Right.
I mean, and again, I thought you did a great job of capturing it. So for you, from your perspective and how you're putting all these pieces together, how would you talk about agency for people that want to know how it fits into this process of subjective depth?
Yeah. I think that's one of the most maybe sophisticated or complex questions, like what is agency? For sure, what it's not is I give now to myself what I have not received. Like that's sometimes a bit of a reduced version of how some people could see it.
Mm-hmm.
That I'm now responsible to love myself, but that can also turn out to be a more of a demanding or goal-oriented way of efforting to be loving or to.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, there is an Austrian psychiatrist, Viktor Frankl. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, he also lived in the US, I think. And I love his perspective. And actually, when it's about agency, I draw on his understanding a lot. Because he says between stimulus and response, there is a space, and that space is our freedom and our responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
And the word responsibility, Verantwortung in German, it's so interesting because Frankl actually says that meaning comes from the ability to respond to your experience or to what life brings to you. And that ability to respond for me is agency. It is the difference between reactivity and responsiveness, and that to find really a response and a choice in how you relate to what shows up in your internal world, but also how you respond to the chronic questions in your life or your most difficult wounds you're walking with, or the most pressing questions you have. How meaning is a kind of a byproduct of how you find yourself being able to find answers. And that this meaningfulness or meaning comes from the response and not from the why question. And that's so true, I find, like that the why question brings us just into philosophical stuck state.
Mm-hmm.
But where does it lead me? How does it feel? How does it affect me right now? That's there, I think the pearls are.
Mm-hmm. The other thing you did that is, again, hard to articulate, So I've kind of simplified it, at least when I first introduced this concept to new folks. But the language I use is that primary emotions ride the back of agency. So that's
Right.
kind of a phrase that I came up with. But I thought you did such a good job of talking about how agency starts to activate, or at least give us more access to our primary emotions. Can you tell folks, because I know this is complex territory to get into abstractly, but can you give people a little bit more of an understanding of what's the relationship between agency and our primary emotions?
I think, yeah, by definition, when we are in the grip of secondary emotions, we are basically being organized by our strategies. And there's so little sense of choice or freedom of choice in that. Yeah, that's why it's complex to talk about it, because maybe this is a bit of a detour, but for me, what gets more and more clear is that for me, the most suitable definition for trauma-informed work, whether it's trauma-informed education or trauma-informed yoga or trauma-informed therapy, is actually to recognize that there can be an absence of inner choice, and that it's not as simple as get yourself together or choose something else for you, you know? Sometimes we are very compromised in our sense of choice. And it can be devastating when you sit on the client's chair and you work with a therapist, and that therapist implies choice where you don't feel choice. That can be so painful. So I think one big element of trauma-informed work is to respect the fact that subjectively we don't experience choice in these places, and we really need somebody who presents with us exactly this place where we don't seem to have a choice, but when we hang in there in a relational space with somebody who doesn't push for something else to happen, then what we call agency, you know, which really slowly kind of comes in a little bit. And that's, for me, precious about that work. And that's just so related to trust and to, yeah, I think the way to get there is kind of, it's the whole art, but when it's there, we can notice. And then there's more confidence to meet these primary emotions that are also scary then, probably. Yeah.
And you talked about the different elements of how we support that in NARM, being reflective insight and embodied experiential or phenomenological processes.
Yeah.
And again, I talk a lot about that too, about this like structure and process approach, because if we just go fully into process, which a lot of the earlier models tended to do, and there's still models out there that are more cathartically based and just, you know, being in the process, we don't have a self-structure to hold these intense emotions that we've spent 20 or 40 or 60 years staying away from. And so when we connect to them, we don't have a self-structure to hold them. But too much self-structure or focusing too much on that then limits, like you talked about before, the right brain processing. And I find that just such a beautiful aspect of NARM, how we hold both and really try to integrate them together. And it does seem like that the emotions, the agency, like these are a big part of how we're balancing both creating greater self-structure, greater capacity to be present with these things while we actually deepen into our feeling sense of them.
Right. And when you, Brad, talk about self-structure, then what you refer to is organizing ourselves by, can you, just for my own understanding, when you talk about self-structure?
Yeah, I mean, I think you talked about in your article about object relations theory a little bit, and that's, you know, where this concept of structuralization kind of really emerged. But even in the C-PTSD diagnosis, they talk about, you know, the three categories. They talk about affect regulation, they talk about interpersonal disturbances, but the third one is interesting. It feels so superficial the way they say it, but it's like negative self-concept, which people can then interpret of like, you know, self-worth and self-esteem. But really, from my perspective, it's so much deeper. It's like, as we both know, connection survival style, like we don't have a self.
Yeah.
The self doesn't exist. And if it tries to exist, it will annihilate, the terror of annihilation. So it's like, how do we actually like develop a real platform sense of self?
Yeah.
And I think that many of the therapeutic models tend to go into processing a lot without understanding how important it is to have that capacity. But then again, if we focus too much, like maybe some of the more cognitive oriented models do, then we don't have room for it to be a lived direct experience.
Right.
Does that align with how you hold that?
Yeah, I was just curious around the term self-structure. It relates to German Ich-Struktur.
Okay.
I think so. Sometimes it's just a language. Yeah.
Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah.
So yeah, you were talking in your article about kind of these different elements, because people ask sometimes, I don't know if they ask you this, but like, how does NARM work? Like they'll just ask me very basic questions, and those questions sometimes are like, oh, well,
Yeah.
wow, how does it work? And I thought you did a really great job of, again, talking about, I know Daniel Siegel talks about, he believes that all healing needs to be on kind of two levels. It needs to be kind of what he calls awareness and then embodiment in a relational process.
Right.
So, and I think in NARM, we hold it pretty similar. Like there's a reflective capacity that we're developing, becoming more aware of our patterns, but there's also this embodied greater capacity to be in the experience. Is that how you were kind of communicating it in your article?
Yeah, that's for sure how I would share your understanding. And I think that the so tricky part is, I mean, if you would ask any therapist if he or she would agree with the fact that it needs insight and it needs embodiment, and then I don't think many would disagree.
That's probably true.
But the way the different schools attempt to get there or to make that happen is so difficult. And because all these ideas to embody and to make that a thing again, to bring somebody into the body or to use affirmations and to try or to anchor them in the body. So to again use kind of will-based approaches for something that can't be done, but is actually a byproduct of another process. And that's so tricky in all this psychotherapeutic talk about what works, because objectification sneaks in everywhere, and it's so subtle, and it's such a fundamental mechanism that I think we still kind of underestimate what that really the scope is of that process, because it just sneaks. It's so subtle that we just then try to do it with our body or bring the emotion into our heart, and all of that actually needs quite a lot of humility to really grasp that principle, because then we can do a lot, but then certain things just open up on their own terms, and we are not the ones who have the main word. How do you say that? And for me, it's about embodiment, and at the same time, then what's the orientation that invites enough safety and trust for that naturally to land and not to be something we go for or try to do.
Yeah, the language that I use is about kind of setting the relational conditions for the emergent process.
Right, exactly.
To happen. Yeah, that's what I hear you saying. And then this leads kind of to the last topic I was really excited to talk to you about, which is about the way that you linked directly to some of the therapeutic enactments that happen is through this kind of goal orientation, that like a client comes in and wants you to fix them, change them in some way from the outside. And then the therapist jumps on it often. And so now you have two people that are acting very will-based, focusing on goals. And yet often the number one thing, I'm sure same for you, that people come to me to do consults around, the number one word they use is, I feel stuck. I'm stuck in therapy. And so it's like people are willing and working hard and have all the best of intentions, and yet they're just feeling more and more stuck. And I'm just so interested. This is really where my passion goes, into these therapeutic enactments that happen, because it's such this fine line between, we want to be receptive to the relational dynamics that our clients are bringing in. So it's like we want to be in the relational field, but we don't want to be of the relational field. Like we don't want to get pulled into the strategies or enactments, because then we can't help someone, because now we're part of the whole strategy and what we call enactment. So there's a lot in what we focus on in NARM is about helping the therapist feel more in their own subjectivity. I'd love to hear more of your thoughts about that, and about maybe some of the work that you're doing with therapists that are studying NARM to help them in this process of becoming more connected to their own emotional depth as they're in their role of therapist with clients.
Yeah, I mean, that opens up so many branches where we could talk about, because for me, that connects to a passion of mine. And that is how we create the teaching and learning environment in trainings in general, but also in NARM trainings. Because what I see is that there's, no matter how warm the invitation, no matter how supportive the field, the theme of self-shaming and judgment and pressure when you are being witnessed by a quote-unquote authority, a TA or teacher, how you offer yourself and support for a client, it's so strong. And what I see is with the best intention, there's still so much pressure and shaming happening in the learning process itself. And for me, that's kind of a fascinating field of development or research. And the reason why I bring it up in this moment is what I see is that people learning the model, or therapists in general, where they get lost or stuck in the countertransference dynamics is when they lose connection to their own subjectivity, to their spontaneity, and to their curiosity. So they kind of cancel themselves out of the equation. And it's a delicate process to sit next to somebody who is ex-training to do, a therapeutic session, and not to teach from the outside, like, hey, let's do this, this is the way we go here in NARM, but more to say, what's really happening for you, and make it a much more relational process where, participants can show up with what they're actually experiencing in that moment until they find back to a curiosity impulse in themselves. And that actually, by definition, then you're out of the countertransference. Because there's no curiosity when you're stuck in that loop. And that's kind of enabling a learning from the inside out more than trying to do it like the teachers say, or trying to,
get it right.
Do an NARM session. And so where that transference piece comes in is really when you negate how important your own impulses are in the process, in your own, where your curiosity is drawn to, and that you're not hypnotized by what the client brings and how you can respond to that, but that you're fully, that's what you're teaching with the 50-50, but that of course is then, what gets lost.
Yeah, it's so interesting how you brought up trainings, because of course we could spend a lot of time talking about that, but there is such a parallel process because, as we both know, particularly newer training assistants, they're also putting a lot of pressure on themselves to do it right, to do the active coaching right, and to teach it right, and to make sure they're satisfying the teacher and all that kind of stuff. And so then they're delivering not much curiosity, not much humility, not much spaciousness. So then the students don't feel that. And that's a very similar thing that's happening when, like you talked about, being in that goal orientation and getting into that enactment where both people are trying really hard and not going anywhere. And so, we do a lot of training with our training assistants about, when you interrupt the process to check in, that you really are checking in. Like, you're really curious. You're not like, there might have been something you're tracking that you might want to reflect on them. There could be another way of saying that, or maybe the timing isn't exactly right, but we really want to start by being in relationship. And I always start my trainings talking about educational trauma. Like, I think it's something that is not talked about enough and I think the reason why it's not talked about enough is because we all take it as normal.
Exactly.
Growing up, we were shamed and afraid, and that's how we associated with learning. And so, we bring that into adulthood. And I think you're talking about the ingredients that we can create a new experience for people, that they can actually be curious and in a discovery process and not in a fear and shame-based process.
Right. Yeah. Exactly how we relate to our clients.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have plans to kind of develop this more? Like, you and I haven't really spent time talking about what your plans are moving forward. What's ahead of you in terms of where you'd like to take this work and your development?
I don't have a clear direction or a 5-year plan, or
maybe I should have asked your intention and your hope. That would have been a better question. Yeah. What are you hoping for yourself moving forward?
Yeah. Well, I hope for myself that understanding of these underlying principles, that NARM is so far, in my eyes, the most suitable model for, the most suitable vehicle, that it transports these principles that I can contribute to, them informing the relational landscape of therapy, and to just keep going with that exploration and that passion. Yeah.
So right now that's manifesting, obviously, in this article that you're sharing, in your clinical work and being a training assistant. Is there any other ways that you're manifesting this?
I offer trainings for coaches and psychotherapists who already, have their ideally process-oriented methods, but who would like to gain just more understanding into certain principles of creating a different relational field, enabling more experiential depth, understand how this, power of intentionality works, and not necessarily, wanting to learn a new method or wanting to learn a new technique, but more enriching their own work with these principles. So that's besides the NARM work that I'm very involved in, is to make these principles also available to people who are not necessarily just fully in the NARM training or immersed in that world, but let them, also move beyond that limits of our work in NARM and to inform more. And for me, that's how I call it. It's just the principle-based process work. And that's what's happening more and more for me here. Yeah.
It's amazing how much alignment we have, because I've been doing this too, and we're actually building a new program right now to offer with Marcia and
really?
with Stephanie. And yeah, because I've been focusing in this area for a while now, and I love doing the trainings, and I'm also excited to free the environment from the trainings, because a lot of what you said about how as soon as there's a clinical model, it's a different relationship to just really having this environment of inner learning. And that's what I'm most excited about. We're going to have to talk more, because it's so cool to hear about what you're doing too.
And speaking of our similarities or shared passions, I think we both really have a strong passion or interest to create teachable structures for something that at first sight seems just an interesting phenomenon or something you cannot quite grasp. I can just imagine how you were spending hundreds of hours watching Larry and basically finding a way to crystallize what he does, what he can do, but maybe not put in words himself. And I also wanted to thank you for that incredible crystallizing process of bringing that. I have a lot of respect, gratitude for that work here. So
that means a lot to me. I appreciate that. And and like I said, when I got your article, I was just super excited, because you did such a great job of taking these. When we start talking about intersubjectivity and the agency, these are so hard to put into words. We're talking about taking this, using the language you were using, like this right brain process, and putting it into left brain. It's like trying to take music and break it apart.
Right.
And you did such a great job with it, and I'm so excited to share it. And also, share it outside of the NARM community, so people get a sense. At least for me, it gave me a little feeling of the magic that you get to when you really start to embody the model. So thank you so much for putting that together and letting us learn from it.
Thank you.
Any other thing you want to share as we wrap up here? Anything you'd like folks to know? Or?
No, it's just a pleasure to spend the time with you, and I really enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, me too. Thanks so much for making the time, and for also just for all the support. I know you're giving support to so many people learning NARM in the NARM community in Europe, and so thanks for that too, because we so need this work out in the world.
Right.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. To find more information about our guest, check the show notes or visit us at complextraumatrainingcenter.com/transforming trauma. You can also connect with us in other ways. We're on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. We hope you're as excited as we are about the upcoming 2025 NARM Therapist trainings. Whether you choose the in-person training in Scottsdale, Arizona, or one of our live online cohorts, this advanced clinical training in the NeuroAffective relational model will transform your practice. Through this advanced clinical training, you'll learn how to effectively address complex trauma and facilitate post-traumatic growth. You'll gain specialized training in a relationally focused, neurobiologically informed clinical approach that supports the resolution of attachment, developmental, relational, cultural, and intergenerational trauma. You'll also be joining a dynamic community that offers multiple learning opportunities to deepen your professional and personal growth. Visit complextraumatrainingcenter.com to register for the 2025 NARM Therapist training that best fits your schedule. We hope you will join us in this special opportunity to advance your clinical practice and make a lasting impact on the lives of those you serve. The Complex Trauma Training Center emphasizes professional development in support of personal growth. We provide clinical trainings, online webinars, ongoing consult groups, mentorship programs, and community events. Our mission is to provide a relational, inclusive, and depth-oriented professional community for those seeking a supportive network of therapists working with complex trauma. To learn more about our trainings, programs, and events, please visit us on our website at complextraumatrainingcenter.com. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Elisa Sponseller for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We look forward to building community and connection with you and changing the world by transforming trauma.